a particle of shell, thinner than a strand of spider silk, breaks free from a dying organism near the ocean's sunlit surface and begins to fall. There is no wind down here. There is no current strong enough to carry it sideways for long. The particle simply descends, turning once, settling, turning again, pulled by gravity through water that grows slowly colder and slowly darker with every meter it crosses. It has no direction it is trying to reach. It has no knowledge of the floor waiting 4 kilometers below. It falls because falling is what small things do in water, and because the ocean is patient, and because the floor has been waiting for a very long time. This is where the story of the deepest plains begins. Not with a map, not with a measurement, but with one particle and one fall, repeated so many billions of times over so many millions of years that the entire floor of the deep ocean has been smoothed into the flattest terrain on Earth. The particle takes weeks to descend those 4 kilometers. Along the way, it passes through layers of water so cold that the temperature becomes nearly constant. It enters a region of permanent darkness where no photon of sunlight has ever reached. It passes through the full height of mountains, through distances that would take a long day to drive on any road, and it covers all of that distance slowly, with no hurry, in total silence and total dark. Before it arrives, it is worth holding the particle itself in mind. It is a fragment of calcium carbonate, the same mineral that forms the shells of clams and the bones of fish, secreted by a tiny planktonic animal near the surface where the light is still warm and food is still abundant. When that animal died, its shell began this journey, and the journey is the first chapter of everything that follows, because the floor that the particle is falling toward was not always flat, was not always quiet, was not always covered in the pale soft sediment that now defines it. The flatness had to be made. It was made slowly. It is still being made. There is a place far below the surface where the chemistry of the ocean changes. For much of the descent, the particle of calcium carbonate holds its shape, its delicate lattice of crystal intact. But somewhere below 3,000 meters, and more decisively below 4,000, the water grows cold enough and pressurized enough that it becomes corrosive to carbonate minerals. The deeper the water, the more aggressively it dissolves any calcium carbonate that passes through it. This threshold has a name. It is called the carbonate compensation depth, and it sits on average somewhere between 4,000 and 4,500 meters below the surface, shifting slightly from ocean to ocean, from basin to basin, with the local chemistry of the water. Above this depth, carbonate shells descend and survive. Below it, they do not. A shell that crosses the compensation depth will lose its edges first, then its finer structures, then its form entirely, dissolving into ions that spread invisibly into the surrounding water before any trace of it can reach the floor. The compensation depth is not a sharp line. It is a transition, a zone of increasing dissolution, a place where shells arrive intact and depart as nothing. A foraminiferal shell, a microscopic globe of calcium carbonate with a surface covered in tiny pores, no wider than a fine grain of sand, may survive the entire dark fall of 3 kilometers in perfect preservation, its walls still crisp and detailed, only to vanish in the final few hundred meters, dissolving completely before it can settle on the sediment below, the floor that lies beneath the compensation depth, then receives no carbonate. Whatever the rain of particles from above once contained, the carbonate has been stripped out by the time it arrives. What remains is clay, red and fine and remarkably stable, along with the silicious remains of organisms that built their bodies from silica rather than carbonate. Diatoms, radiolaria. These silica-built shells resist dissolution where carbonate shells do not, and they accumulate in soft pale drifts called silicious ooze on the floors of the deepest basins. Where the seafloor sits above the compensation depth, a different sediment collects. There, the carbonate shells survive their fall and pile up slowly into a sediment called calcareous ooze, pale and fine, composed almost entirely of the compressed and reworked remains of tiny surface organisms. The composition of the sediment on any given plane tells something of the depth of the water above it and the chemistry of the ocean that filled it. But the chemistry of the falling particles is only part of how the flatness came to be. At the very deepest level, below all of this, there is rock, old rock. The floor of the ocean is made of oceanic crust, basalt, dark and dense, and formed far from where it rests now. Every meter of oceanic crust begins its existence not at the bottom of a deep basin, but at the crest of a mid-ocean ridge, where two plates of the Earth's outer shell are pulling apart and hot rock wells up from below to fill the gap. The new crust is thin and hot and ridged with volcanic structures. It is built in the fiery orange of fresh basalt, piled into submarine mountains and fissured by the stresses of its own formation. A ridge crest is nothing like a flat plain. It is rough and varied and geologically alive. The mid-ocean ridges run for tens of thousands of miles beneath every major ocean. They form the longest mountain range on Earth, though no part of it breaks the surface except in a few places, like Iceland, where the ridge has built itself high enough to emerge from the sea. Everywhere else, the ridge sits in water, its crest sometimes only 2 kilometers below the surface, far shallower than the abyssal floor, its flanks sloping gradually away in both directions as the spreading plates carry the newly formed crust away from the place of its birth. As the crust moves away from the ridge, it cools. Cooling rock contracts, contracting rock sinks. This happens slowly, over tens of millions of years, the seafloor subsiding by degrees as the heat of its formation bleeds away into the water above it. A piece of oceanic crust that begins its life at the shallow ridge crest will, over the course of 100 million years, sink by several kilometers as it migrates toward the interior of the ocean basin. The old crust at the edges of the ocean, farthest from the ridges that made it, is deepest, coldest, and most fully settled. And as it sinks, it gathers sediment. The rain of particles from above is constant. In the open ocean far from any coast, the rate of accumulation is very slow, perhaps 1 centimeter of sediment every 1,000 years, perhaps less. But 1 centimeter every 1,000 years, maintained across tens of millions of years, becomes meters and then tens of meters, and eventually, in some places, hundreds of meters of sediment layered over the basalt below. The rocky, irregular surface of the volcanic crust is gradually buried. The peaks and ridges of the original seafloor terrain are smoothed over, first softened, then hidden, then entirely covered by the slow accumulation of falling particles from the world above. This is how the flatness is made. Not by any single event, not by a catastrophe or a sudden transformation, but by patient accumulation across time, so long that it has no equivalent in human experience. The sediment does not hurry, the crust does not resist. The particles keep falling, season after season, million year after million year, and the floor becomes, in the fullness of time, the flattest terrain on the surface of the planet. The flattest. It is not a loose claim. Abyssal plains, the name given to the deep sediment-covered floors of the ocean basins, have gradients of less than 1 in 1,000 in many regions. In some areas, they are so level that deviations of more than a few meters are exceptional across distances of hundreds of miles. No desert, no prairie, no ancient dry lake bed on dry land approaches this kind of horizontal regularity. The Great Plains of North America, flat as they seem, tilt perceptibly. The salt flats of the Bolivian Altiplano undulate. The abyssal plains do neither. They are genuinely, precisely flat, and they are the largest continuous flat surfaces on Earth. They sit at depths between 3,000 and 6,000 meters. At 4,000 meters, the water pressing down from above weighs the equivalent of 6,000 kilograms on every square centimeter of the seafloor, a pressure that would crush any unprotected structure in moments. The temperature of the water is close to freezing, perhaps 2 degrees Celsius, perhaps 4, stable across decades and centuries in a way that nothing on the surface can match. The plain is cold, dark, still, and immense. And though it seems as though nothing could disturb it, the record of its formation is interrupted, occasionally, by events that arrive without warning and with tremendous force. Along the continental margins, where the abyssal plains meet the slopes of the continents, sediment accumulates far faster than it does in the open ocean. Rivers carry fine clay and silt from the land into coastal waters, where it settles slowly onto the continental shelves and slopes. Over time, sediment builds up on those slopes in layers, growing thicker, growing denser, growing heavier. Sometimes an earthquake strikes. Sometimes a section of slope becomes too steep and too loaded to hold. And when it fails in a way that is not a slow crumbling, but a sudden massive release, a turbidity current, a dense suspension of sediment and water that moves down slope under its own weight, accelerating as it goes, sweeping across the floor of the ocean in a fast gray wall of suspended silt. A turbidity current in full motion is not like anything on the surface. It travels in complete darkness at speeds that would match a car on a highway, or sometimes exceed one. It carries with it a vast load of sediment, enough to bury and reset the surface of the plain across an enormous area. The current surges across the floor, losing energy as it goes, until it spreads thin and slows and eventually stops. The suspended sediment settles out, the heaviest grains first, then the finer clay on top, leaving behind a distinct layer, coarse at its base, fine at its top, that geologists call a turbidite. These turbidite layers are the punctuation of the abyssal plain's long story. Between them, the slow continuous rain of pelagic particles lays down its thin, quiet laminations. The turbidites arrive suddenly, covering everything, then the quiet resumes. Core after core drilled through abyssal sediment shows this alternation, the thin gray bands of turbidite interrupting the pale background of pelagic ooze. Each turbidite records a moment of violence somewhere up the slope. The pelagic layers between them record centuries of stillness. Across the plains nearest to the continents, the sediment can be extraordinarily thick. Where rivers have been delivering material for tens of millions of years, and where turbidity currents have been resetting and resmoothing the surface again and again, the total depth of sediment can exceed 10 kilometers. More than 10 kilometers of compressed and consolidated material, layer after layer, each one a record of something that happened in the ocean above, a bloom of plankton, a storm that stirred the coastal shelf, a glacial melt event that flooded the rivers with fine rock flour and sent it cascading into deep water. The sediment is a library. Its pages are very thin and very numerous and very old. The oldest sediment on any given abyssal plain is not at the surface, it is at the bottom, nearest to the basalt below. These deep layers have been compressed by everything piled above them, and they have been sitting undisturbed in some basins for tens of millions of years. In the least disturbed regions, far from turbidity currents, far from vigorous bottom currents, the sediment record is continuous and intact across an almost incomprehensible span of time, each thin layer laid down in order, each one available to be sampled and read by the organisms of instruments that humans have only recently learned to lower to such depths. This is one of the qualities that makes abyssal plains unlike any other environment on Earth. They are not merely flat and remote, they are ancient in a way that most of the Earth's surface is not. The continents are constantly eroded and rebuilt. The mountain ranges rise and are worn away. The soils of the land are mixed by roots and worms and rain and frost into a medium that is thoroughly present tense, continuously reworked. But the deep floor of the ocean accumulates in sequence, undisturbed, and the sequence holds. Outside the reach of turbidity currents, in the quietest central parts of the great ocean basins, the sediment builds up at 1 centimeter every 1,000 years. 1 centimeter, the average human fingernail, grows more than that in a week. Set beside the pace of the surface world, this is a rate so slow it approaches stillness, yet across 50 million years, that rate produces 500 meters of sediment. Across 100 million years, a kilometer. The slow is not nothing. The slow, given enough time, becomes geological. There is something worth settling into about the pace of it. The abyssal plain does not accumulate quickly. It does not respond to individual seasons, to particular storms, to the comings and goings of surface life on the time scale of centuries. A century on the abyssal plain adds perhaps a millimeter to the sediment. A single human lifetime adds a layer thinner than a coat of paint. The changes that register on the abyssal floor are those of the ocean itself, the great slow cycles of glacial advance and retreat, the long-term shifts in the chemistry of the sea, the gradual movement of the continents that reshapes where deep water forms and where it flows. This is why the plain is flat, not because nothing has happened there, but because what has happened with such patience and over such spans of time that each irregularity has been covered, each rough feature buried, each small disturbance smoothed by the next 1,000 years of quiet accumulation. The mid-ocean ridge where the crust of a given plain was born may lie 2,000 miles away now. The crust has traveled that distance over tens of millions of years, moving perhaps 2 to 5 centimeters per year, about as fast as a fingernail grows. At the ridge, the crust was new and hot and rough. At the plain, it is old and cold and buried beneath sediment that has been accumulating since before the continents were arranged the way they are today. The crust has completed its long migration from the warmth of its birth to the stillness of its resting place, and the sediment has covered it so thoroughly that no instrument on the seafloor's surface would know the rock below existed. What the abyssal plain presents at its surface is not rock at all. It is sediment, soft, fine, pale, or reddish, depending on its composition, yielding slightly under the weight of anything that rests on it. The sediment surface is the floor that matters for everything living on it or in it, the medium through which the chemistry of the ocean above and the rock below is mediated, the record on which the long story of the ocean is written in thin, patient layers. And the layers keep accumulating. Right now, at this moment, particles are falling from the surface of every ocean on Earth. Fragments of dead plankton, fecal pellets from small crustaceans, grains of clay carried out to sea by wind, mineral particles weathered from the land. Each one is making its own slow fall through kilometers of dark and cold water, losing a little of its substance to the bacteria that colonize it during the descent, arriving at last diminished but real at the surface of the sediment below. Each one adds its immeasurable fraction to the sediment layer building on the floor. The accumulation is invisible on any human time scale. A person could watch the abyssal plain for a lifetime and never see the surface change. The changes are there, a grain here, a fragment there, but they are below the threshold of any observation the unaided senses could make. Only instruments sampling over decades, only sediment cores extending back through millions of years, can make the accumulation legible. The rate is too slow to see. The result, across enough time, is everything. Consider the sediment not as a uniform substance, but as a record of events, and the layers become something like chapters. There are chapters written in calcareous ooze, pale and fine, laid down during warm ocean intervals when plankton bloomed in surface waters, rich in carbonate, and their shells rained down in abundance. There are chapters written in silicious ooze, recording the expansion of diatom-rich cold waters. There are chapters written in red clay, the most resistant and insoluble material of all, accumulating in the deepest basins, where carbonate does not survive, and silica is sparse. Chapters written when the ocean above was less productive, or when the basin was more corrosive, and where the distance from land was so great that almost nothing reached the floor at all. Each type of sediment tells a different story. Each contact between one layer and another records a transition, a shift in the ocean's chemistry, in the circulation of its waters, in the climate of the atmosphere above. Read in sequence from top to bottom. A sediment core from an abyssal plain is a continuous archive of environmental history, reaching back tens of millions of years. Its chapters written not in words, but in mineral composition and fossil content, and the isotopic ratios of elements locked into microscopic shells. Turbidite layers break the sequence where they occur, bringing coarser material from nearer the coast, mixing older sediment into younger, interrupting the quiet progression. But even these interruptions are information. They record the earthquakes and slope failures that sent the currents racing across the plain. They record past sea levels, because lower sea level during glacial times changes where sediment piles up and where it is likely to fail. The turbidites are the exclamation points in a text otherwise composed of long, quiet sentences. The plains themselves are arranged in the basins between the mid-ocean ridges and the continental margins. In the Atlantic, the Great Plains lie east and west of the mid-Atlantic ridge, filling the basins on either side with their flat, sediment-covered floors. In the Pacific, which is large enough to contain continents, abyssal plains spread across enormous areas, though the Pacific Basin is more tectonically active and has more seamounts and volcanic features interrupting the floor. In the Indian Ocean, the plains fill the spaces between the spreading ridges that are pulling Arabia from Africa and India ever so slowly northward. Every major ocean has them. Together, abyssal plains cover more of Earth's surface than all the continents combined. They are, in area, the dominant landscape of the planet, the largest single environment, and yet they are among the least visited, the least mapped, the least seen of any terrain on Earth. More of the abyssal floor remains unseen than the surface of the moon. The floor is simply too deep, too pressurized, too cold, and too remote for easy access. What is known has been pieced together from sediment cores, from acoustic mapping, from the rare descent of remotely operated instruments, from samples brought up in the jaws of dredges and the chambers of coring devices lowered on cables many kilometers long. What the mapping has revealed, even in its incompleteness, is the extraordinary scale of the flatness. Hundreds of thousands of square miles in the North Atlantic, where the gradient is effectively zero. Comparable stretches in the Central Pacific, the Argentine Basin, the Angola Basin, the Somali Plain. These are not approximate or impressionistic flatnesses. They are measurable, verified, among the most precisely horizontal surfaces that nature produces anywhere in the solar system. The flatness emerged from the meeting of several slow processes, none of which was aimed at producing it. The thermal subsidence of the crust created the deep basins. The continuous rain of particles from above began filling them. The turbidity currents smoothed out the rougher features of the crust below. The weight of the accumulating sediment compressed what was already there. And over time, not any particular moment in time, but across a span of time that has no clean beginning and no end that is yet in sight, the rough became smooth, the high became low, the basin became flat. The flatness is not finished. It is still being made. The particles are still falling. The crust is still slowly sinking as it cools. Where turbidity currents occur, they continue to spread new layers across old ones. The mid-ocean ridges continue to produce new crust, which begins its own long journey from birth to burial. The process that made the plains began hundreds of millions of years ago and will continue for hundreds of millions more, long past any moment that concerns anything living today. And at the beginning of all of it, at the very first chapter, the one that underlies every subsequent layer, is the oceanic crust itself, formed in orange and black at the ridge crest, cooling as it moves, sinking as it cools, until it arrives at its resting place in the quiet darkness of the deep basin and waits for the sediment to cover it. A ridge crest glows with the heat of fresh basalt. The rock is still plastic in places, still mobile, still forming its irregular surface of pillowed lava and fractured flow fields. The water at the ridge is warmer than the water of the surrounding deep, not warm by surface standards, but warm enough that the thermal gradient can be measured, warm enough that the crust is still giving up the heat of its formation to the ocean above it. The ridge is the youngest part of the seafloor. Everything older is somewhere farther away, somewhere cooler, somewhere deeper, somewhere more buried. As the crust moves away from the ridge, the heat leaves it. The basalt, which was pliable at the crest, becomes rigid and cold within a relatively short time. The thermal contraction that follows is slow, a few centimeters of subsidence per million years in places, more or less depending on the spreading rate and the local thickness of the lithosphere. But it is relentless, and it operates on a time scale that dwarfs any other kind of change visible on the surface of the land. A mountain range rises and erodes in tens of millions of years. The ocean floor, the plain then, is not a simple thing. It is the surface expression of a system extending from the deep interior of the planet to the sunlit surface of the ocean above, connected through time by the movement of the crust and the fall of the particles. It looks featureless. It is featureless in the sense that there are no peaks, no valleys, no visible structures to mark one stretch from another across the field of view available to any instrument or eye that has ever reached it. But beneath that surface, and recorded within that surface, is one of the most complete and continuous histories that the Earth maintains anywhere on its body. The particle that began this descent, that thin, delicate fragment of calcium carbonate from a surface organism long dead, arrives, after its weeks of falling, at the top of this record. It settles into a surface that has been receiving particles in exactly this way for longer than the Rocky Mountains have existed. It becomes part of the next thin lamination, the newest line in the book, the most recent page in a text that started being written when the continents were arranged very differently, when the ocean that the particle fell through had different chemistry, different temperature, different life in its sunlit upper waters. The particle does not know any of this. It rests on the sediment surface in the cold and the dark, one grain among uncountable billions, the newest piece of a record that will go on accumulating long after every trace of the organism that made it has dissolved into the surrounding water and been dispersed. In the deep basins of the ocean, the crust continues its slow descent. The sediment continues its slow accumulation. The carbonate compensation depth continues to dissolve carbonate shells and pass silica and clay through to the floor below. And the plains extend across the floor of the ocean in their great flat quiet reaches, the oldest, calmest, most complete geological record that the Earth keeps, built not from any particular event or any particular process, but from the patient, unhurried cooperation of time and gravity and chemistry and the slow cooling of rock that was once hot enough to flow. The last volcanic heat of a young section of oceanic crust, one that began its life at the ridge crest long before there were animals on land, bleeds slowly into the water above it, diminishing year by year until it is finally gone, and the crust arrives at the temperature of the surrounding deep ocean and comes to rest, thoroughly cooled, thoroughly sunken, thoroughly buried, in the stillness that is the abyssal plain's defining condition. It has traveled far. It has taken a very long time, and now it is still. 200 meters below the ocean surface, the last of the light gives out. It does not go all at once. Near the surface, the water holds a bright shifting ceiling of green and silver, alive with the movement of waves. Deeper, the green thins to blue. The blue thins further, cooling in tone and in temperature both, losing warmth degree by degree as the depth accumulates. Particles drift past in the remaining light, small white flecks of organic matter, the slow confetti of a living ocean, still faintly visible, still catching what little illumination remains. And then, at a depth of roughly 600 feet, the last photon of usable sunlight is absorbed into the water around it, converted to heat so faint it is barely measurable, and the light is simply gone, not dimmed, not twilight, gone in the way that a sound gone is not a quieter sound, but an absence where sound was. Below that depth, the darkness is of a quality that has no equivalent on land. On land, darkness is always temporary and always partial. There are stars. There is the glow of a distant town carried on low cloud. There is the slow arrival of dawn even before the sun rises that begins to erode the dark from its edges. The darkness of a room with the curtains drawn is interrupted every few minutes by a passing car, a phone screen, the faint ambient light of a city filtering through fabric. But the darkness below 600 feet of ocean has no edges. It does not thin at the horizon. It is not waiting for dawn. It extends in every direction without interruption, across thousands of miles of flat terrain, and it has been doing so without a single exception for as long as the ocean has been this deep. That is a very long time. The darkness is not an event, it is a condition. 3,000 feet down, then 4,000, then 6,000. The water column above is becoming something that can be weighed. Hydrostatic pressure builds at a rate of roughly 1 atmosphere for every 33 feet of depth by the time the seafloor appears, and here, on the abyssal plain, the floor is somewhere between 10,000 and nearly 20,000 feet below the surface. The pressure has accumulated to something between 300 and 600 times what the air exerts at sea level. That number is difficult to hold in the imagination by itself. It becomes more legible as a physical sensation. On every square inch of the flat seafloor surface, the weight of the water above presses down with a force equivalent to several tons. The sediment does not buckle under it. The sediment has been under that same weight for millions of years and has settled into a permanent and absolute stillness beneath it. Nothing about this stillness is dramatic. That is the point of it, and it takes a little time to understand. The conditions of the abyss, the pressure, the cold, the dark, do not announce themselves the way a storm does. They are not loud. They do not move. They are simply present, without variation, without interruption, in a way that almost nothing else on earth is. A storm passes, a drought ends, a winter gives way to spring, but the darkness below the photic zone does not give way to anything. It waits at the same depth year after year, century after century, neither deepening nor lifting, and the organisms that have found a way to live within it have done so not by enduring something temporary, but by making a home in something permanent. The water down here was not always here. That is worth sitting with for a moment. The cold that characterizes the abyssal plain, a temperature that holds, year after year, between roughly 34 and 39 degrees Fahrenheit, did not originate at this depth. It came from the surface, from the poles, where seawater chilled against the atmosphere and against sea ice until it became dense enough to sink. Cold water is heavier than warm water, and dense enough polar surface water does not simply cool where it sits. It begins to descend, slowly and steadily, away from the surface and toward the floor. That sinking feeds the great thermohaline circulation, the slow global conveyor that carries surface properties into the deep and eventually brings them to the abyssal plains of every ocean basin on Earth. The journey takes decades. Water that left the surface of the North Atlantic or the Weddell Sea may spend 50 years or more making its way down through the water column, drifting through the intermediate and deep layers before finally arriving at the abyssal floor. By then, the season that produced it is long past. The people alive when it began its descent may no longer be alive when it arrives, but the cold is preserved. The water that reaches the abyssal plain is still very close to the temperature it had when it left the polar surface, because the insulation of the deep ocean is so effective and the transit so slow that almost no heat has entered it along the way. It arrives cold, and it stays cold, and the temperature of the abyssal floor barely fluctuates across decades. That cold carries something with it. At the polar surface, before the water sank, it was in contact with the atmosphere and absorbed oxygen from the air, the way a cold glass sweats in a warm room. Cold water holds dissolved gases more effectively than warm water does. The oxygen dissolved into the surface water before the descent began, and the descent preserved it. By the time the water reaches the abyssal plain, it carries roughly 4 to 6 milliliters of dissolved oxygen per liter, enough to sustain aerobic life in the sediment, and just above it, enough to allow the organisms of the deep floor to breathe. They breathe slowly, and they need very little, but they need some, and the slow conveyor that brings cold polar water to the abyssal floor has been delivering it, steadily, for a very long time. Not every part of the deep ocean is equally well supplied. In certain enclosed basins, where the circulation of bottom water is restricted by underwater topography, and fresh cold water does not arrive often enough, the existing oxygen is slowly consumed by the organisms living there, and is not replenished at a matching rate. These places develop what are sometimes called oxygen minimum zones, layers of water so depleted that aerobic organisms cannot persist within them, where the conditions are simply too chemically limited to sustain the kind of life that requires oxygen to function. In these zones, the ecology shifts entirely. Different organisms, different processes, different chemistry, but on the great open abyssal plains, fed by the slow, steady arrival of cold polar bottom water, oxygen is present, and life, sparse and quiet as it is, continues. The darkness, then, is not empty. It is dark, and it is cold, and it is under enormous pressure, and it is vast, and most of it has never been visited by any instrument or observer in the history of human curiosity about the deep. But it is not empty. The sediment at the floor holds living organisms in its uppermost layers. The water just above the floor carries traces of dissolved organic matter, drifting down from the sunlit world above. And in the permanent night of the abyssal plain, across thousands of miles of flat terrain, unmarked by any feature that would be visible to a human eye, something is always happening, slowly, continuously, at a scale of time and space that makes human measurements seem briefly inadequate. The blackness itself has a quality to it that is worth pausing inside. Darkness at the surface of the ocean, at night, is broken by the stars above and by the bioluminescence that many surface organisms produce. The greenish flash of a wave disturbed by a swimming animal, the brief sparkle trailing a ship's hull, the slow pulse of a jellyfish lit from within. Below the photic zone, those surface phenomena are irrelevant. The waves do not reach here, the stars are not visible. The turbulence of the surface, the seasonal changes, the cycles of day and night that organize almost all life on land and in the upper ocean, none of these penetrate to the abyssal plane. What remains is the darkness itself, which is not nothing. The darkness is the context in which every other property of the abyss exists, and it shapes those properties in ways that take time to appreciate. In that darkness, small flashes do occur. Bioluminescence, the production of cold light by living organisms through chemical reactions carried out in specialized tissues, is common in the deep ocean, far more common than most accounts suggest. Many of the animals that move through the water column between the surface and the abyssal floor produce light. Some do so to attract prey. Some do so to communicate with others of their kind. Some appear to do so defensively, producing a sudden burst of light when threatened, startling a predator or illuminating it for a larger predator above. The light is blue-green in most cases, a color that travels somewhat further through seawater than other wavelengths. Each flash lasts a fraction of a second. A single flash illuminates perhaps a few feet of surrounding water before the darkness absorbs it completely, and then the darkness closes back in as if the light had not happened. These flashes are not warm. They carry no radiant heat, only light, and the light is brief and cold and travels a very short distance before being gone. A collection of them, observed from a distance, would look like a slow, irregular, patternless scatter of pale sparks. Nothing like the continuous glow of a city seen from above, nothing like fireflies in a field, but still a form of light in a place defined by its absence. The plain itself is too dark and too far below for any of this to reach. On the sediment surface at the floor of the abyssal plain, even bioluminescent light from the water column above is attenuated to nothing by the time it arrives. The floor is dark in a way that goes beyond the ordinary meaning of the word. The pressure at the floor is something that no sensory description fully captures, because the human body has no experience of it to draw on. At sea level, the atmosphere presses on every square inch of exposed skin with a force of roughly 14.5 pounds. Breathing, moving, thinking, all of this happens at one atmosphere of pressure, and the body is calibrated for it so precisely that the pressure itself is not felt at all. At abyssal depths, the pressure is between 300 and 600 times greater. On every square inch of the floor, the equivalent weight of tens of thousands of pounds presses down, not in a way that is concentrated on a point, not a sharp force, but a uniform and total compression from every direction, above, below, and all sides simultaneously. There is no way to breathe inside this pressure without mechanical assistance. There is no way for a mammal to survive it unprotected, and yet organisms do. The life of the abyssal plane has not adapted to this pressure in the sense of tolerating it heroically. It has evolved to function within it as a normal condition, the way surface life functions within one atmosphere without noticing. The enzymes that drive the chemical reactions inside abyssal cells are shaped differently from the enzymes of surface organisms, built to remain flexible and functional under compression that would deform and stop the equivalent enzyme of a surface-dwelling animal. The membranes that surround abyssal cells are made with lipids that stay fluid under high pressure, where a surface-adapted membrane would solidify and fail. These are not dramatic accommodations. They are quiet biochemical adjustments made across enormous spans of evolutionary time, and they represent the ordinariness of the abyss to the organisms that live within it. Pressure is not a challenge the abyssal organism faces. It is simply where the abyssal organism is. Cold works in a similar way. At 34 to 39 degrees Fahrenheit, the water of the abyssal plane is close to freezing, though the salt content keeps it liquid below the standard freezing point of fresh water. For a warm-blooded animal from the surface, this temperature is dangerous, the kind of cold that produces hypothermia within minutes in an unprotected human, that slows the heart and clouds the mind. For the organisms that inhabit the abyssal floor, this temperature is simply the ambient temperature of the only world they have known. Their metabolisms run slowly. Their enzyme systems are tuned to function in the cold rather than in spite of it. Chemical reactions that would be sluggish or stopped in a warm adapted organism proceed steadily, if slowly, in an abyssal one. The cold is not an obstacle they overcome. It is the medium in which their biology has always moved. The combination of cold, pressure, and darkness creates a habitat of extraordinary stability. Most environments on Earth are defined in part by change, seasons, tides, the cycling of day and night, the variability of weather, the fluctuations of temperature between decades. The abyssal plane is defined instead by the near total absence of these things. The temperature of the water at the floor shifts by perhaps a fraction of a degree across a full year. The pressure does not fluctuate. The darkness does not vary. The chemical composition of the bottom water, the concentrations of oxygen, the dissolved mineral content, the slow trickle of organic matter arriving from above, changes on timescales of decades or centuries, not days or hours. For an organism with a short enough memory, or with no memory at all, the abyss is a world without seasons, without weather, without the rhythmic swings that organize life at the surface. In this stability, there is something that resembles, from a distance, lifelessness. An observer dropping rapidly through the water column from the sunlit surface would notice the life thinning as the depth increased. Fewer fish, fewer invertebrates, less movement, less biological activity of every kind. The density of living things falling away as the light fell away and the pressure built and the temperature dropped. By the time the observer reached the abyssal floor, the living material present per cubic yard of water would be a small fraction of what it was at the surface. The plane would look bare, the sediment would look undifferentiated. The water above it would look empty, but empty is not quite right, and bare is not quite right, and the observer's impression would be shaped by the scale at which human vision operates and the speed at which human perception moves. The organisms of the abyssal plain are small and slow and spread across enormous distances. A square mile of abyssal sediment holds living things, bacteria and archaea in the sediment layers, small worms moving through the uppermost centimeter of the floor, tiny crustaceans picking through the organic film on the sediment surface. They are not abundant by the standards of a coral reef or a kelp forest or even a temperate seafloor at a few hundred feet, but they are present and they are continuous, and they have been present and continuous for far longer than the coral reefs have existed in their current form. The benthic storms are a periodic interruption of the usual near stillness. Under ordinary conditions, the near bottom currents of the abyssal plain move so slowly that measuring them requires specialized instruments left in place for long periods. A fraction of an inch per second is not unusual. At this velocity, a particle of fine sediment, disturbed from the surface, might drift for hours before settling back down, a few feet from where it started. The flat terrain is not swept by anything, it accumulates, but periodically, driven by changes in the overlying water column, changes in the large-scale circulation of the ocean, seasonal density variations, the effects of distant weather systems that somehow propagate downward through kilometers of water, the near-bottom current increases. For hours or days, the abyssal floor is swept by bottom water, moving faster than the sediment particles can resist. A thin veil of silt lifts from the plain, carried up into the water column a few inches or a few feet, suspended briefly in the current as it moves across the terrain. Organic matter that had settled into the sediment is resuspended. Oxygen is redistributed. The chemical environment at the sediment surface shifts, then the current slows. The suspended silt begins to settle. Particle by particle, grain by grain, it drifts back down through the cold, dark water toward the floor, and the plain reassembles itself in near silence. The sediment that settles is not identical to the sediment that was lifted. It may have traveled some distance, may carry slightly different organic content, may have been exposed to oxygenated bottom water during its brief suspension in a way that alters its chemistry. The plain is not quite the same after the storm as it was before, though the difference would require careful measurement to detect. The benthic storm has passed and left behind a record of itself in the sediment, a very thin and very faint record, which will be buried in turn by the next few centuries of slow accumulation from above. These episodes do not erase the stability of the abyssal environment. They are interruptions within a much longer stillness, the way a single deep breath interrupts a sleeping body's slow and even rhythm without waking it. The abyssal plain returns to stillness after each one, and the stillness that returns is the same stillness that preceded it, the same temperature, the same pressure, the same absolute dark, the same near motionless bottom water creeping at a pace slower than a fingernail grows. There is something about the permanence of this stillness that is difficult to arrive at through ordinary experience. It asks for a different kind of attention than most environments do. A forest asks to be looked at. There is movement, there is light changing through leaves, there are sounds and smells, and the obvious activity of living things. A coral reef is visually overwhelming, densely populated, constantly in motion. Even a desert, apparently empty, has the wind and the heat and the vast sky and the occasional animal crossing the open ground. The abyssal plain asks for none of these attentions. It offers darkness and cold and the faint chemical traces of organic matter slowly arriving from above, and it has been offering precisely these things, without augmentation or embellishment, for tens of millions of years. The cold arriving from the poles continues to come. Decades after a surface water mass chilled and sank in some distant polar sea, it is still making its way through the intermediate ocean, still carrying its dissolved oxygen, still preserving within itself the temperature of the surface it left behind. Eventually, it will reach the floor of an abyssal plain, and its oxygen will be available to the organisms waiting there in the dark, and its cold will add to the cold that is already there, and it will settle into the near motionless layer of bottom water, just above the sediment, and begin its own slow drift across the plain. That drift will take years. The water will not be much changed by the journey, and the plain will not be much changed by the water's arrival. In some ocean basins, the circulation is more vigorous than others. In the deep North Atlantic, newly formed cold, dense water descends and spreads relatively quickly, keeping the bottom water well oxygenated and the sediment chemistry fairly active. In the deep Pacific, which is larger and whose bottom water sources are more remote, the circulation is slower and the bottom water older by the time it arrives. The age of the water at the abyssal floor of the Pacific, measured by the decay of dissolved radioactive isotopes accumulated since the water left the surface, can be more than 1,000 years. The water sitting a few feet above the sediment at the floor of the deep Pacific was last in contact with the surface atmosphere when the world above was entirely different from the world it is now. It carries no awareness of this. It is simply cold and dark and dense and almost perfectly still. The stability of these conditions over geological time, not just the centuries during which any given parcel of bottom water maintains its character, but the millions of years across which the abyssal environment has maintained roughly the same temperature, pressure, darkness, and sparse nutritional input, is part of what has shaped the organisms that live there. Evolutionary pressure on the abyssal plane is not the pressure of a rapidly changing environment that demands quick adaptation. It is the pressure of an environment that barely changes at all, that rewards the organisms capable of functioning at the lowest possible metabolic cost, the ones that need the least energy, produce the least heat, move the least, grow the slowest, and wait with the most patience for the next small delivery of organic matter from above. These are not virtues in any ordinary sense. They are simply the shape that survival has taken at the bottom of a very deep, very cold, very dark, and very old ocean. The light that failed at 600 feet above did not take anything essential with it, at least not by the standards of the abyss. The organisms of the abyssal plane do not need it. They have never had it. Their metabolisms run on the carbon that arrives from the surface in diminished, transformed form. The organic particles of marine snow, the dissolved fragments of things that once lived, and on the chemical processing of that carbon by the microbial communities in the sediment. Photosynthesis does not happen here. The energy that drives the surface ocean, the energy that organizes the entire food web of the upper water column, the energy that arrives as sunlight and is captured by phytoplankton and passed upward through the food chain, none of that energy arrives at the abyssal floor in its original form. It arrives late and diminished and transformed, and the organisms of the floor have built their lives around it in its diminished state, the way a fire burns low in its last hours, slowly and quietly, without the bright leaping of the flame it was. The near bottom current moves. It does so at a velocity difficult to imagine as movement at all, fractions of an inch per second, a rate so slow that a particle of silt carried within it would require hours to cross a single yard. The plain stretches in every direction for hundreds of miles, then thousands, absolutely flat, absolutely dark, absolutely cold, its surface undisturbed by anything moving faster than the current that barely moves. The sediment at the floor lies as it has lain for centuries, its surface layer carrying the faint chemical signals of recent organic deposition, the layers below carrying records of older and older events in the ocean above, each lamination a record held in permanent stillness beneath miles of water and the weight of the world pressing down. And in this stillness, faint and continuous, the cold current moves across the plain at a pace slower than sleep, carrying with it the dissolved memory of a polar surface it left behind decades ago, delivering oxygen, delivering cold, delivering a faint ongoing chemistry to the organisms waiting in the dark at the floor. The plane receives it without response that any instrument has yet been fast enough to catch. The water moves, the sediment does not. The darkness holds, as it has always held, as it will continue to hold, complete and unvarying, in the long patient interval between one slow current and the next. A small pellet, dense and dark, begins to fall. It was made near the surface in the bright upper water where tiny animals fed and were fed upon, where life was quick and warm and lit by ordinary daylight. One of those animals, a copod no larger than a grain of rice, had been eating and processing and moving through its days in the shallow ocean for weeks before it produced this pellet, this compact package of half-digested organic matter wrapped in a thin membrane and released into the water. The pellet is heavier than the water around it, so it sinks. At first the descent is quick. The water near the surface is warm and relatively thin, and the pellet moves through it without much resistance, tumbling slowly as it goes. There is still light here. Faint blue-green columns of it reach down from the surface above, shifting with the movement of waves, growing dimmer as the pellet falls away from them. 50 feet down, 100, the light becomes a quality of the water rather than illumination, a faint ambient glow that would make nothing visible to human eyes, but is still technically present, still technically day. The pellet falls through it without caring, without awareness, without anything. It is only matter, organized briefly, falling now toward disorganization. 200 feet below the surface, the light ends, not gradually, not in stages, but in the way that sleep ends. Ordinary thought. The water simply goes from dim to dark, and then the dark is total. The pellet continues falling through it. Around it, the water has begun to cool. The pressure has already built enough that a small air bubble, had there been one, would have compressed to a fraction of its surface size, but there is no air bubble. There is only this pellet falling, and the cold dark water it is falling through, and the long distance still remaining between where it is and where the ocean floor lies waiting. Bacteria have found it already. They attach to the pellet's outer membrane within the first day of its fall, drawn by the chemical traces it released into the surrounding water. They are small enough to be invisible to any eye, but there are hundreds of them, and they are working. Each one takes in molecules from the pellet's surface and breaks them apart, extracting energy and releasing simpler compounds back into the water around them. The pellet is being consumed as it falls. Its outer membrane softens and begins to break down. Its interior, densely packed with organic particles, begins to lose coherence. What was a recognizable object, a fecal pellet, with edges and a distinct composition, is slowly becoming something less defined, a cluster of particles with a shared downward trajectory, a loosening archive of what once lived near the surface. This is the beginning of marine snow. The term describes everything that falls from the upper ocean toward the deep. Fecal pellets like this one, the shells of dead microorganisms, fragments of mucus produced by filter feeding animals, the remains of phytoplankton cells that bloomed and died, the shed skins of molting crustaceans, the decaying tissues of larger animals broken apart by predators and current into smaller and smaller pieces. All of it falls. All of it is being consumed as it falls. And the deeper it goes, the longer it has been falling, and the more of it has already been broken down and absorbed by the bacteria working on it through the entirety of its descent. By the time a particle that left the surface in autumn reaches the seafloor in late winter or early spring, it has traveled something close to 2.5 miles through cold, dark, pressurized water, and it has lost the vast majority of what made it nutritious. Some estimates suggest that less than 2% of the organic carbon produced at the ocean surface ever reaches the abyssal floor. The rest is intercepted on the way down, metabolized by bacteria and small animals in the middle depths, converted back into dissolved compounds and carbon dioxide, absorbed into the water column, and lost to the creatures waiting below. What arrives at the floor is the residue of the residue, a faint chemical whisper of what once was food. The pellet, what remains of it, settles onto the sediment sometime in late winter. There is no sound when it lands. There is no disturbance visible to any eye, because there are no eyes present, and because the impact of a loose cluster of organic particles on a surface of fine clay and ooze generates no force worth measuring. It simply comes to rest. The particles spread slightly across the surface, held there by the weak stickiness of the sediment, and then they are still. A few bacteria continue their work on the freshest fragments. The rest will be processed more slowly over days and weeks by whatever organisms move across this plane. The plane itself is immense. It stretches in every direction without interruption. No hills, no valleys, no rocks breaking the surface of the sediment, no current strong enough to move it. The sediment underfoot is soft and fine, built from millions of years of particles like this one, accumulating in layers so thin that a single human lifetime would add less than a centimeter to the total depth. The water above the plane is just above freezing. The pressure at this depth would collapse a metal drum in a fraction of a second. And across all of it, across thousands of miles of flat, cold, dark seafloor, the marine snow continues to fall, grain by grain, particle by particle, delivering its small and diminishing cargo to a world that has learned, over vast time, to make the most of very little. This is not a world of abundance. It never was, but it is a world of extraordinary efficiency and of life so well fitted to its conditions that it has persisted here for longer than most life on Earth has existed at all. The bacteria are everywhere. They live in the water column above the plane, and they live on the sediment surface, and they live within the sediment itself, in the upper layers where oxygen still penetrates, and below those layers where it does not. The ones in the deepest sediment live in conditions that would seem impossible by the standards of the surface world. No light, almost no oxygen, almost no food, under pressures that would destroy most organic chemistry instantly. Yet they persist, metabolizing at rates so slow that their activity is nearly unmeasurable by ordinary means. A single microbial cell in the deep sediment may divide once in 1,000 years. It may go tens of thousands of years between consuming one organic molecule and the next. It is alive by any technical definition, but its pace of life is so different from the pace of surface life that the same word barely covers both. In the deepest sediment layers, archaea, an ancient domain of single-celled life distinct from bacteria, may be especially dominant. These organisms, some of which may be thousands of years old, as individual cells carry out chemical reactions that release tiny amounts of energy from the minerals and buried organic matter around them. Sulfate reduction, methane production, the slow oxidation of ancient carbon buried when the sediment was young. Each of these processes releases almost nothing by the standards of the surface world, a photon's worth of energy, a single molecule's worth of chemical work, but multiplied across the entire seafloor and across geological time, the cumulative effect is one of the largest biological processes on Earth. The microbes of the abyssal sediment collectively hold more carbon in their bodies than all the plants and animals of the land surface combined, by some estimates. They process nutrients slowly, but they process all of them, cycling nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur back into forms that can be used again, maintaining a kind of geochemical housekeeping that the entire ocean depends on. The sediment surface, where oxygen is still present, hosts a more active microbial community. Here, bacteria decompose the freshest organic inputs, the marine snow particles and fecal pellets that have only recently arrived, with relative speed. Measured against the interior of the sediment, this activity is almost brisk. The top millimeter of abyssal sediment contains a living community that processes incoming organic matter, breaks it into its components, and makes those components available to the slightly larger organisms that graze on bacterial films. Nematodes, worms narrower than a human hair, so small that they move between sediment grains rather than through them, feed directly on bacteria and on the dissolved organic matter surrounding them. There are more nematodes in a square foot of abyssal sediment than there are people in a large city. They are the most abundant animals in the deep sea, and almost no one knows they are there. The nematode's world is measured in fractions of an inch. It moves through the spaces between sediment grains the way a person might move through a forest, navigating three-dimensionally through a landscape that is entirely dark and entirely felt rather than seen. Its chemical senses detect gradients in dissolved oxygen, dissolved organic compounds, the metabolic byproducts of bacteria living on nearby grain surfaces. It moves toward higher concentrations and away from lower ones, following the chemistry of its world with a precision no instrument can match at this scale. It eats, it reproduces, it dies, and its body is decomposed by the same bacteria it spent its life eating, and the cycle continues, generation after generation, in a darkness that has never once been interrupted by light. Slightly larger than the nematodes, and slightly less numerous, are the polychaete worms, segmented, many-bristled animals that range in the abyss from the size of an eyelash to the length of a finger. Some move across the sediment surface, foraging for organic particles with sensory appendages that can detect chemical gradients in the water just above the seafloor. Others burrow into the sediment, pushing through the upper layers and disturbing the fine laminations that thousands of years of slow deposition have laid down. A single polychaete burrowing through the sediment in search of buried organic matter can displace particles that have not moved since before human civilization began, mixing them with particles that arrived yesterday, erasing the thin record of deposition and replacing it with the churned mottled texture of biological activity. Scientists reading sediment cores can see this mixing, visible as blurred or disrupted layering, and know from its pattern that living things have been at work here, even when those living things are long gone. These small bodies, the nematodes, the polychaetes, the foraminifera that build their tiny shells from sediment grains, represent what scientists call the meiofauna and macrofauna of the abyssal plain. They are not the largest animals here, but they are by far the most numerous, and they account for most of the biological processing that takes place in the sediment. Their feeding, burrowing, excreting, and dying collectively rework the upper sediment layer on timescales of decades to centuries, making nutrients available, mixing old and new organic material, and maintaining the chemical gradients that drive the entire sediment ecosystem from top to bottom. The diversity among these small animals is greater than it appears from a distance. Across a single square mile of abyssal plain, the species composition of polychaetes may include dozens of distinct forms, each occupying a slightly different niche, feeding at a slightly different depth in the sediment, tolerating a slightly different range of organic content or oxygen concentration. This variety arises from a simple fact. The arrival of organic matter on the abyssal floor is not uniform. Marine snow does not fall as an even blanket. It arrives in patches, concentrated where surface productivity above was higher, thinned where it was lower. Currents carry particles and deposit them unevenly. The carcass of a jellyfish falls in one place. A dense mat of phytoplankton cells settles nearby. A bare patch of sediment receives almost nothing for decades. Each of these differences creates a microhabitat with a slightly different food availability, and over a long time, slightly different communities colonize each one. The plain looks uniform from any distance, but up close, at the scale of the organisms living in it, it is a mosaic of distinct conditions, each supporting its own particular set of lives. There is a kind of patience here that has no equivalent in the surface world. A polychaete waiting in the sediment for an organic particle to drift close enough to sense may wait for a very long time, but it is built for waiting. Its metabolism is calibrated to the pace of delivery, burning almost nothing during the intervals between meals, capable of surviving on stores that a surface animal would exhaust in hours. The abyss does not reward speed. It rewards the ability to persist through stillness, to hold on through the long intervals between one meal and the next, to remain alive and functional during the months or years when almost nothing arrives, and then sometimes, without warning, the stillness breaks. A whale dies somewhere in the upper ocean. Its body, which has been neutrally buoyant while air remained in its lungs, begins to sink as gases escape and tissues compress. It descends through the same water column the marine snow drifts down through, but far faster. A sperm whale 60 feet long and 60 tons in weight falls through the water in hours rather than months. A dense and sudden gift of organic matter delivered to a point on the abyssal floor that has seen almost nothing of this kind in perhaps decades or centuries. The whale settles onto the sediment with a force that the plain has not felt in a very long time. Its body displaces the sediment beneath it, pressing into the soft clay, breaking the flat surface. The smell, or rather the chemical trace, the dissolved compounds of decomposing fat and protein spreading outward through the near bottom water, begins to diffuse in all directions from the moment of impact. Carried by the faint abyssal currents at speeds too slow to feel, but fast enough to reach animals waiting hundreds of meters away. Within hours, the first arrivals appear. Sleeper sharks, drawn by olfactory senses calibrated to detect traces of decay across enormous distances, arrive first and begin feeding. Grenadier fish follow, circling the carcass, feeding from the edges. Hoagfish arrive, ancient, jawless animals that push into soft tissue and consume it from within, their bodies writhing through the carcass in darkness. The feeding is not frenzied by the standards of the surface world. Everything here moves slowly, constrained by cold and pressure and the energy cost of movement at this depth. But compared to the ordinary pace of the abyssal plain, the activity around the whale fall is extraordinary. A carcass that would be stripped clean in days on a tropical reef may take years to reach the same state in the cold and dark of the abyss, not because the eaters are less thorough, but because the temperature slows every chemical reaction and every muscular movement to a fraction of its surface rate. The whale is not simply food, it is a landscape. As the soft tissue is consumed over the first months and years, the whale fall transitions through a series of ecological stages, each dominated by different organisms, and each releasing different kinds of nutrients into the surrounding water and sediment. The bones themselves, massive, dense, and soaked with lipids that have been accumulating in the whale's skeleton for decades, represent a resource that will persist long after the soft tissue is gone. Bacteria that specialize in consuming bone lipids colonize the whale's skeleton, forming dense mats of white and yellow microbial growth across the surface of each rib and vertebra. These bacteria carry out a form of chemistry similar to what happens at hydrothermal vents. They produce hydrogen sulfide as a byproduct of their metabolism, and that hydrogen sulfide supports a small community of organisms that can use it as an energy source, a miniature chemosynthetic ecosystem on a whale's bones on the abyssal floor. The whale fall community may persist for 100 years or more. The bones decay slowly, their lipids consumed at the pace the bacteria can manage, which is slow indeed. The surrounding sediment, enriched by the organic matter that has rained down from the carcass in the years of its decomposition, supports elevated densities of nematodes and bacteria long after the whale itself is unrecognizable. A circle of altered sediment, tens of feet across, will carry the chemical signature of the whale's presence for decades after the last bone has been broken down, its carbon redistributed into the broader sediment, its phosphorus cycling back into the forms that the next generation of microbial life can use. A single whale fall delivers more organic matter to one point on the abyssal floor than that same patch of sediment would receive from marine snow in a century. It is a concentrated surge of energy in a world that runs on traces, and the community that assembles around it is correspondingly richer and stranger than the ordinary abyssal fauna, a temporary abundance in the midst of permanent scarcity, a brief intensification of life around a dying thing, the deep ocean's version of an oasis. The vent is a different kind of miracle. Somewhere on the abyssal floor, not on every plane but on some, the seafloor cracks along a line where tectonic plates are pulling apart, or where volcanic heat rises close to the surface. Seawater percolates down through fissures in the crust, traveling miles into the rock, where it is heated by magma and enriched with minerals dissolved from the surrounding rock, sulfur compounds, metals, silica, before being expelled back upward through chimneys or diffuse flows at temperatures that may exceed 700 degrees Fahrenheit at the vent's throat, cooling rapidly as they meet the surrounding water just above freezing. In the hot mixing zone where vent fluid meets cold seawater, bacteria and archaea find the conditions they need to carry out chemosynthesis. They oxidize the hydrogen sulfide in the vent fluid, extracting energy from the chemical reaction rather than from sunlight, and they use that energy to build organic carbon from carbon dioxide in the surrounding water. They are the base of a food web that has no connection to the sun. Everything living at a vent community, every tube worm and mussel and shrimp and crab, is ultimately eating the energy of the earth itself, the heat of the planet's interior, converted by microbial chemistry into biological matter. Tube worms at an active vent can grow to 6 feet in length, their bright red plumes extended into the warm mineral-rich water to absorb oxygen and sulfide for the bacteria living within their tissues. The bacteria are not separate from the tube worm. They live inside it, in a specialized organ, and the tube worm provides them with the chemicals they need, while they provide the tube worm with the organic compounds it needs to live. The two organisms have become so thoroughly integrated that neither can survive without the other. Around the tube worm clusters, white crabs pick at bacterial mats on the rocks, and small fish hover at the edges of the warm water, and snails graze across surfaces encrusted with mineral deposits that the vent has been building for decades. The vent community is not part of the abyssal plain's ordinary ecology. It is an island within it, a point of concentrated energy surrounded by the vast quiet of the surrounding seafloor. But the vents matter to the broader abyssal world in ways that go beyond their own communities. The minerals they release into the water column eventually distribute across the wider ocean. The organic matter produced by vent bacteria and consumed and excreted by vent animals eventually, through death and decomposition, contributes to the general pool of organic matter that settles across the surrounding plain. The vent is an engine, small by the standards of the surface ocean's photosynthesis, but significant in the context of a world that runs on so little. And the vent communities are not permanent. The heat that drives them shifts as the volcanic geology beneath changes. A vent that has been active for decades may suddenly stop, its fluid cut off, its temperature dropping rapidly toward that of the surrounding water. The tube worms die. The bacteria lose their substrate. The crabs and shrimp disperse or starve. Within years, what was one of the most biologically dense environments in the deep ocean becomes a field of empty chimneys and decaying skeletal material, slowly being consumed by the ordinary abyssal community as it returns to its baseline of quietness and scarcity. New vents open elsewhere, and the process begins again, the organisms that can travel between them doing so, seeding new communities across the vast distances of the deep sea floor. The microbial community that remains after the vent dies processes its organic legacy with the same patience it applies to everything else. The bones and shells and accumulated organic matter of the vent community enter the sediment and are decomposed over decades, enriching the surrounding plain for a time before being fully incorporated into the background levels of buried organic carbon. The plain absorbs the vent, as it absorbs the whale, as it absorbs the marine snow, grain by grain, molecule by molecule, in no hurry, across time that makes hurry seem irrelevant. What unifies all of this, the marine snow and the whale falls and the vents and the patient microbial community processing it all, is the quality of persistence. Life in the abyss does not flash and burn, it endures. It calibrates itself to delivery rates that would seem impossible anywhere closer to the surface, finds ways to extract usable energy from compounds that surface organisms would not recognize as food, maintains populations across enormous distances on resources so thin they are barely measurable. The ecological machinery of the deep seafloor is finely tuned to exactly the conditions it operates under, and it has been running without interruption for far longer than most ecosystems on Earth. The diversity of small invertebrates on abyssal plains has long seemed puzzling to scientists, given how little food is available to support it. On land and in the surface ocean, areas of low productivity tend to support low species diversity. Few organisms, few species, a simplified ecological community. The abyss should, by this reasoning, be nearly empty. Instead, it holds a surprising richness of forms, particularly among the small animals living in and just above the sediment. The explanation, pieced together over decades of careful study, comes back to the patchiness of organic matter delivery. Because marine snow does not fall uniformly, Because whale falls and vent communities create local concentrations of organic matter, because currents redistribute particles in complex and shifting patterns, the abyssal floor is not a uniform environment at the scale of the organisms living in it. It is a mosaic of microhabitats, each slightly different, each with its own history of organic matter deposition, each capable of supporting a slightly different community. An organism specialized for one type of microhabitat, one set of organic compounds, one range of sediment depth, one particular bacterial community, can coexist with others specialized for adjacent microhabitats because the habitats are different enough that the species do not fully overlap in their requirements. The plane that looks empty is at the scale of life that actually lives in it, full of distinct places, each with its own particular set of residents. This is not easy diversity to see. It requires careful collection and painstaking identification, the sorting through of sediment samples to find and count and name organisms smaller than a grain of rice. It requires patience of a kind that mirrors the patience of the organisms themselves. But the work has been done over decades of research by scientists working at the edge of what is technically possible, lowering instruments into the deep and waiting and recovering what they could, and what they found was not the biological desert the early oceanographers expected. It was a community sparse, slow, and finely structured, but a community nonetheless, with predators and prey, and decomposers and grazers, and all the trophic relationships that define a functioning ecosystem, simply operating at a pace so much slower than the surface world that its activity is almost invisible to ordinary observation. There is a form of life here that takes the concept of patience to its furthest limit, in the deepest sediment layers, where organic matter is not fresh, but ancient buried when the sediment was young, chemically altered over thousands or millions of years of compression and warming. Bacteria persist in a state that is almost beyond the capacity of human imagination to encompass. A cell that has been alive for 1,000,000 years, dividing perhaps once in 10,000 years, metabolizing perhaps one molecule of organic matter per decade, is alive by every technical criterion. It has a membrane, it processes chemical reactions, it maintains a chemistry distinct from its surroundings. But its experience of time, if experience is even a meaningful concept at this level of biological organization, bears no resemblance to any biological timescale familiar from the surface world. It is life at geological pace. Life is a property of rock. Life is something that matter does when given enough time and the right conditions, regardless of whether there is anything to support it in the conventional sense. The deep sediment community does not require marine snow. It does not require whale falls. It runs on what was buried long ago, on the residual energy locked into organic compounds that were trapped in the sediment during periods when the surface ocean above was more productive than it is now, or when turbidity currents carried large pulses of organic matter from continental margins out across the plain. That buried resource is nearly exhausted in some areas, freshly replenished in others. The bacteria work it down, slowly, over geological time, and when it is gone from one horizon, they move, if movement is even the right word for an organism that may relocate by a millimeter over a century, to another. And above this deepest layer, the sediment community grades upward through increasing activity to the sediment surface, where the marine snow is freshest and the oxygen is highest, and the nematodes graze, and the polychaetes burrow, and the fecal castings of larger animals alter the local chemistry in ways that create new microhabitats for yet smaller organisms. And above the sediment surface, the water column just above the plain carries its own community of organisms, drifting or swimming or resting, connected to the sediment below by their feeding and their dying and their excretion. And above that, the full depth of the ocean stretches upward to the surface, where the light begins again. The fecal pellet that began this story is no longer recognizable. Its membrane dissolved weeks ago, its internal structure dispersed across a few square inches of sediment surface. Its component molecules have been incorporated into bacterial cells, some of which have since been eaten by nematodes, whose bodies have in turn been partially decomposed and partially ingested by polychaetes that have moved on through the sediment to other feeding grounds. The carbon atoms that were once part of a copod near the ocean surface are now distributed through a community of organisms on the abyssal floor, each carrying a fragment of what was once a single small act of animal metabolism near the sunlit surface, now parceled out into the slow and patient life of the deep. This is how energy moves in the abyss. Not in floods and surges, not in the rapid pulses of a coral reef or a forest canopy, but in traces and residues, in molecules passed from organism to organism, across distances and timescales that make the surface world seem frantic by comparison. The system is not inefficient. It is efficient to an almost unimaginable degree because it has had to be. Every gram of organic matter that reaches the abyssal floor is processed completely, passed through one organism after another, converted and reconverted, until nothing is left that any living thing can use. The plane takes everything it is given and uses all of it. Nothing is wasted because nothing can be. And somewhere on the plane, resting against a patch of sediment that is slightly richer than the surrounding area, where a whale fall's legacy has not quite faded, where the bacterial community is slightly denser, where the nematodes are slightly more numerous, a whale carcass lies in its fourth decade of slow dissolution. It arrived before the oldest organism, now living in the sediment around it, was born, if born is the right word for an organism that divides so infrequently that a generation spans centuries. The carcass is bone now, mostly. The soft tissue is long gone. The bones themselves are dark and porous, their lipid content nearly exhausted, the bacterial mats that once covered them reduced to thin films on the densest cortical surfaces. But the community around it persists, subtly elevated in density and diversity compared to the plane beyond, shaped by a gift of organic matter that has now been circulating through this small patch of seafloor for 40 years and will continue to circulate for decades more, diminishing slowly toward the background level of the ordinary plane. The animals attending the whale will not depart. Exactly. They will not leave in any meaningful sense, because leaving requires the kind of mobility and energy budget that few creatures here possess. They will simply persist, and as the local enrichment fades, their numbers will gradually return to the background levels of the surrounding plane, indistinguishable from the wider community, their brief abundance dissolved back into the patience of the ordinary abyss. The whale will have given everything it had to give, and the plane will have taken it all, quietly, in the dark, in no hurry, over the full span of a human lifetime and more, leaving at the end only sediment and the steady invisible work of life going on within it. The feeding tentacles move first, before the rest of the animal stirs, before the slow body shifts its weight across the sediment. The tentacles are already at work. They are pale and branched, arranged in a ring around the mouth, and they press into the surface of the abyssal floor, one by one, in a motion so measured and continuous that it resembles breathing more than feeding. Each tentacle lifts, extends, presses down into the fine gray sediment, gathers what it finds against the mucus-coated surface of its tip and draws back toward the mouth. Then the next, then the next. The animal does not pause between one tentacle and the next. It does not assess what it has gathered or wait for better conditions to arrive. In the permanent dark of the deep plain, 4 kilometers below any surface the light has ever reached, this rhythm simply continues, has continued, will continue, steady as a pulse, and nearly as slow. The animal itself is the length of a human forearm. Its body is cylindrical and soft, pale enough in the light of a research camera to look almost white, though in the absolute darkness of its habitat, it carries no color that any eye could read. Along its sides, small projections mark the body wall at intervals. Beneath the skin, if the angle of the light is right, the dim shapes of internal organs are just visible, suspended in fluid, shifting faintly with the movement of the whole. The sea cucumber is not a fast animal. It moves across the sediment at a pace of centimeters per minute, which means it crosses the width of a human hand in something close to 10 minutes, and a single meter of abyssal plain might take the better part of an hour. Yet it does not stop. It has no reason to hurry, and in 4 kilometers of cold, dark water pressing down from above, there is nothing here that rewards haste. What the tentacles gather is by any casual measure almost nothing. The surface sediment of an abyssal plain is fine-grained and gray, composed mostly of clay particles, silicious fragments of radiolarians and diatoms, the dissolved-away remnants of foraminifera, and a very thin film of microbial life coating the particles and living between them. The organic content of this sediment is low. What arrives at the abyssal floor from the sunlit ocean far above has already been processed and reduced and processed again during weeks of descent. So what finally settles is less food than the ghost of food, a faint chemical residue clinging to particles that are themselves smaller than the width of a human hair. The sea cucumber eats this. It eats all of it without selection, pressing its tentacles into the gray surface and drawing sediment into a digestive tract that extracts the microbial film and whatever scraps of organic carbon still cling to the clay, then passes the cleaned particles out the other end. The animal moves forward as it feeds. The sediment behind it is subtly changed. Each day, a single sea cucumber passes through its digestive tract, a volume of sediment roughly equal to its own body weight. This is not a small number when held against the scale of the animal, the forearm-length body, the soft, cylindrical form, but it becomes something else entirely when held against the number of animals spread across the plain. On certain abyssal plains, sea cucumbers of the group called elpidiids account for more than 90% of all visible animal biomass. They are not rare here, they are everywhere. Camera surveys lowered to the sea floor and allowed to sweep across the surface show them spaced a few meters apart in every direction the frame can reach. Pale forms resting at the sediment surface, feeding tentacles in motion, bodies orientated loosely by the near bottom current. From above, the view resembles a kind of grazing, a slow herd spread across a plain in silence and total dark, each animal doing the same work in the same unhurried way, with no awareness of the others moving a few meters beyond. The sediment they pass through is changed in ways that take careful measurement to detect, but matter greatly to the chemistry of the floor. What enters the animal's mouth is raw abyssal sediment, clay and silica, and the faint organic film, all mixed together in the proportions in which they settled. What leaves the body at the other end has a different fingerprint. The grain size distribution is shifted by the processing. The microbial biomass clinging to the particles is reduced, because the digestive tract has extracted what it can. The concentrations of bioavailable nitrogen and phosphorus are altered in ways that mark the casting as something distinct from the surrounding sediment. These castings are not simply waste, they are a secondary surface, a new microhabitat, chemically different from the plane around them, and bacteria begin colonizing them within hours of deposition, drawn by the altered chemistry, the way organisms elsewhere are drawn by warmth or light. Small nematodes follow, tiny crustaceans. The casting becomes, in the days and weeks after its deposition, a small and temporary island of elevated biological activity in a landscape where biological activity is thin and widely spaced. This is the work. It does not announce itself. It leaves no visible trace from any distance greater than a few centimeters, but across the full extent of the abyssal plain, thousands of kilometers of flat sediment in every direction, the cumulative passage of sediment through holothurian digestive tracts has measurably restructured the upper sediment column over decades, mixing and altering the chemistry of a layer that might otherwise rest undisturbed for centuries. The sea cucumber's work is not dramatic, it is not fast, it happens in darkness, at depth, under pressure that would collapse a human body in an instant, in water just a few degrees above freezing, at a pace so slow that any individual moment of it would look to a casual observer like stillness. But it is continuous, and it is vast in its aggregate, and without it, the abyssal plain would be a different and much quieter kind of floor. The group of sea cucumbers most specialized for this life belongs to the family Elpididae. Among them are several genera, Elpidia, Peniagoni, scotoplanes, each shaped slightly differently, each carrying the same basic biology into the abyssal environment with small variations. Scotoplanes is perhaps the most arresting to the eye of a deep-sea camera, and it is the one that most rewards a slow observation. Its body is translucent. The skin is thin enough that the digestive organs inside are visible, the gut tracing its route through the body cavity, the fluid within shifting as the animal moves. From the underside, a row of modified tube feet provides slow locomotion across the sediment surface. Along the sides' lateral extensions, modified podia project outward from the body wall, and it is these that make scotoplanes capable of something most sea cucumbers are not. It can lift off the seafloor, not quickly, and not for long, and not with anything that could be called intention. The lateral podia act as paddles when the animal extends them into the near bottom current, and under the right conditions the body rises slightly from the surface and drifts. Time-lapse imagery from benthic landers, instruments left on the seafloor for months at a time, recording at intervals too slow to feel like motion, but fast enough to reveal change, show aggregations of scotoplanes shifting their position across the plain as the near-bottom current carries them. Where food is locally depleted, the animals drift. Where organic particles have settled in slightly greater concentrations, a fresh fall of marine snow, a small accumulation of organic matter caught by some irregularity in the terrain, the animals gather. The aggregations form and disperse and form again over timescales of weeks. The plain that looks featureless and static from any fixed point is, across its full extent and across the months, a shifting landscape of slow biological response. A scotoplanes at rest on the sediment is a still thing. The feeding tentacles move at the mouth. The body wall shows the faint motion of the organs inside. The lateral podia rest against the sediment, not extended, not paddling. There is no sign from outside of the animal's capacity for something other than this settled slow feeding. And then, With the faint shift of a current that carries no warmth and makes no sound, the podia begin to extend. The front of the body lifts slightly. The animal drifts forward, off the surface, into the water column above the plane, not far, and not for long, but free of the sediment for a moment, suspended in the dark water 4 kilometers below the sun's last photon. Then the current slows or changes direction, and the animal settles again, and the feeding tentacles resume, and the rhythm continues as though nothing happened at all. The permanent cold of the abyssal environment makes every biological process slower than it would be in warmer water. Chemical reactions that drive digestion, cellular repair, reproduction, all of these run at a pace set by temperature, and in water held just above freezing by the slow descent of polar surface water from thousands of kilometers away. The pace is very slow indeed. The sea cucumber's metabolic rate is low. Its movements are correspondingly unhurried. Even its response to disturbance, a sudden light, a vibration in the water, is gradual rather than sudden. There is no need for speed here. The predators of the abyssal plain are few, and the food the animals are processing is not going anywhere. The sediment has been accumulating since before the continents held their current positions. There is time. The animals seem to operate from a kind of deep temporal patience that is not patience as a choice, but patience as a condition of the environment, the same patience in which the clay layers formed, in which the volcanic rock beneath the sediment cooled and subsided over tens of millions of years, in which the ocean itself has been dark at this depth for longer than there have been animals complex enough to feed in it. In the water just above the sediment surface, the pressure is approximately 400 times what it is at the ocean's surface. This is the weight of 4 kilometers of water pressing down without interruption, and it is not a metaphor, but a physical reality that the sea cucumber's body must accommodate at the cellular level. The enzymes that drive its biochemistry are evolved for this pressure, different in their three-dimensional shape from the equivalent enzymes in animals at the surface. Stable, where a shallower water enzyme would deform and lose its function. The lipid membranes of its cells are differently composed, with a fluidity that allows them to flex and function under conditions that would harden and immobilize the membranes of their surface-dwelling relatives. Every cell in the sea, cucumber's body, is built for a world that would kill most living things, and it carries this adaptation without effort, the way an animal at the surface carries the simple fact of air. The feeding tentacles press into the sediment again. The motion is smooth and unvarying, each tentacle completing its arc in roughly the same time as the one before it, the whole ring cycling through in a continuous sequence that does not distinguish one moment from the next. The animal has no brain in any sense a vertebrate would recognize, only a nerve ring around the mouth and a network of nerves extending through the body wall, and so there is no experience of time passing, no accumulation of moments into anything like a day. There is only the current state of things, pressure, cold, the chemistry of the sediment at the tentacle tip, the concentration of dissolved oxygen in the water flowing slowly past. If these are within the range the animal can sustain, it feeds. It has been feeding in this way, on these floors, in ancestors going back further than most of the rock formations on any continent. Across the sediment in the radius of a few meters, the plain shows the marks of the sea, cucumber's passage, in ways that a careful instrument could read, but that no eye would notice from a distance. There are faint tracks in the surface where the body has dragged slightly, then lifted, then dragged again. There are castings, small mounds of processed sediment, subtly lighter in color than the surrounding surface, each one a day's worth of work, passed through one animal and deposited behind it. between the castings, in the spaces where the tentacles have pressed and lifted, the surface has a slightly smooth texture, the finest particles displaced and resettled in a pattern that differs from the undisturbed sediment nearby. These marks accumulate slowly and are slowly erased by the near bottom currents that occasionally stir the upper sediment layer back into suspension. Nothing here is permanent. The casting from this morning will be colonized and gradually dispersed. The track from last week has already smoothed back into the gray, but new marks are always being made, because the animal is always moving, always feeding, always passing sediment through a body that has been shaped by 100 million years of this same dark work. There are places on the abyssal plain where the density of sea cucumbers is high enough that the bioturbation they create, the mixing and reworking of the surface sediment, is measurable by instruments dropped to the floor and left to record over months. Benthic landers equipped with sediment traps and cameras capture the passage of animals across the frame, the deposition of castings, the gradual displacement of marker particles placed at the surface to track mixing rates. The numbers that come back from these measurements are not large by the standards of surface biology. The mixing is slow, the displacement per animal per day is small, but the plains are vast, and the animals are present across all of them, and the aggregate effect of this slow individual work, summed across hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of flat abyssal sediment, is a measurable and significant contribution to the chemistry of the seafloor, the cycling of nitrogen, the turnover of organic carbon, the redistribution of nutrients that would otherwise lie locked in the sediment, inaccessible to the microbial communities that depend on them. The sea cucumber does not know this. It has no knowledge of what it does or why it matters. The nerve ring around its mouth detects the chemical composition of sediment and triggers the feeding response. The lateral podia detect current, and under some conditions, drive the lifting and drifting behavior. The digestive tract processes what the tentacles deliver and extrudes what remains. None of this requires any representation of the world, any model of cause and effect, any sense of the work being done or the plane being crossed. And yet the work is done, and the plane is crossed, and the sediment is turned over, and the castings are deposited, and the bacteria and nematodes follow, and the chemistry shifts, and the abyssal floor remains a living system rather than an inert one, not because anyone planned it or because any animal pursues it, but because the bodies of these animals, moving through the sediment for their own simple cellular reasons, happen to accomplish it as a consequence. This is, in a way, the deep economy of the abyssal plane. No single transaction is large. No single moment is significant. The fecal casting of one sea cucumber on one morning in 1 square meter of the Pacific abyssal plain is an event of vanishingly small consequence. But the system is not made of single moments. It is made of the continuous accumulation of small moments across immense space and immense time, and in that accumulation, something that functions like maintenance emerges, a slow, distributed, never finished processing of the sediment that keeps the floor from becoming a purely geological thing, keeps the carbon cycling, keeps the microbial communities supplied with the varied chemical surfaces they need to persist. A peniagone moves slowly across the sediment, a few meters from the scotoplanes. It is smaller than the scotoplanes, its body more compressed, its lateral extensions less pronounced. Its feeding tentacles work the same surface with the same measured rhythm. The two animals are not aware of each other in any way that would constitute awareness. There is no signal between them, no coordination, no competition at this scale of density and resource. They simply occupy adjacent territories of sediment, feeding at the same pace, in the same darkness, under the same pressure, moving in directions determined by the very slight current that barely stirs the bottom water. From above, if there were any light to see by, they would look like two pale cylinders resting nearly still on a gray surface, separated by a few meters of sediment that shows the faint marks of previous passage by each of them or by others before them. The sediment between them has been accumulating since long before either animal was born. The rate of deposition on this plane is somewhere between 1 and 10 centimeters per 1,000 years, a number so small it barely accommodates being called a rate at all. The gray that the tentacles are pressing into, now settled in layers over centuries. A centimeter down, the sediment is centuries older than the surface. 10 centimeters down, it may record conditions from before any holothurian living today was alive, before the current arrangement of the ocean circulation that feeds cold oxygenated water to this depth. The sea cucumbers feed at the surface and reach no more than a centimeter or two into the column below, so the history beneath them is undisturbed. The geological record is safe below the biological one. The animals process only what has most recently arrived, only the freshest thin film of accumulation, and pass it through their bodies and return it to the surface with its chemical character subtly altered, and move on. There is an elpidia on the far side of a slight rise in the sediment surface, not a true rise, not a feature that any geologist would name, just a place where the sediment has accumulated a few centimeters thicker than its surroundings and created a gentle slope of no more than a degree or two. The elpidia has crossed it without event. Its body is small, its form more slender than the scotoplanes, and it moves slightly faster across the surface, which is to say that it covers a meter of sediment in somewhat less than an hour, rather than slightly more. The feeding tentacles do not slow for the slope. The sediment on the rise is the same as the sediment on the plane below it, and the animal processes it with the same steady rhythm. At the base of the rise, just downslope, there is a fecal casting from the previous day. It is a small mound of processed sediment, perhaps 2 centimeters across, with a surface texture slightly different from the surrounding plain. Under the cold water, in the dark, bacteria are already at work on it. The chemical signal that marks the casting as distinct from the surrounding sediment is detectable at microscopic scales, the bioavailable nitrogen slightly elevated, the microbial biomass in the process of rebuilding after being reduced by the passage through the digestive tract. Nematodes, organisms smaller than the casting itself, are already present in the sediment, immediately adjacent, drawn by something in the chemical signature that distinguishes this small deposit from the gray around it. The casting will persist as a distinct feature of the sediment surface for days before current and slow diffusion begin to reduce its chemical distinctness, before the nematodes depart and the bacterial colony stabilizes and the mound subsides back into the surrounding gray. By then, the elpidia will have deposited others, a trail of them across the plain at the pace of its movement, each one briefly elevated in biological activity, each one slowly returning to the background, each one replaced by another a few centimeters ahead of the last. The near bottom current, almost too slow to measure without sensitive instruments, moves water across the plain at a fraction of a centimeter per second. This is not wind. It is not felt as movement by anything without the sensory apparatus to detect it, but it carries dissolved oxygen, and it carries the faint chemical traces that constitute the only long-range communication across this landscape, the molecule-thin signals that tell a scavenging organism where something worth moving toward has settled. or that carry the products of microbial metabolism from one patch of sediment to another. The sea cucumbers are not reading these signals in the way that some other abyssal animals do, but the current that carries them is the same current that lifts the lateral podia of the drifting scotoplanes, the same current that shaped the distribution of organic particles on the sediment surface before the animals arrive to process them. Everything here is connected by water that moves slowly in the same direction, carrying what it carries, arriving at the far side of the plane with the memory of the near side dissolved into it. In the hours that pass, and hours pass here with no marking, no change in light or sound to indicate 1 hour from the next, no seasonal shift, no tidal event of sufficient force to disturb the surface sediment. The feeding tentacles continue their measured work. The pale body moves forward, centimeter by centimeter. The castings accumulate behind. The sediment ahead has not been processed by this individual before, though it has almost certainly been processed by others. The plane is old, and the animals have been present long enough that every patch of sediment has passed through holothurian digestive tracts many times over in the deep history of this floor. There is no virgin territory here, no unworked sediment, in any time scale that matters to the organisms living on the surface now. They work sediment that was worked before, that will be worked again. The material cycles, the castings of one generation become the sediment of the next, colonized and processed and passed on. The plane is not accumulated waste. It is a living layer, thin and cold and sparse, turned over slowly and continuously by the bodies moving through it. The biological patience required for this, not patience as a felt experience, because there is none, but patience as a structural fact of the life, is built into the pace of every process at this depth. The metabolic rate is low. The reproductive rate is low. The growth rate is low. An abyssal sea cucumber does not grow quickly or reproduce often because the energy available from the sedimented processes is not sufficient to support rapid growth or frequent reproduction. It sustains itself. It maintains the cellular machinery of its body at the minimum cost the cold and pressure and darkness allow. What is left after that sustenance goes into growth, slowly, and into the eventual production of the next generation, slowly, and into the processing of the sediment, steadily, without pause, for as long as the animal lives. The scotoplanes has moved 3 meters from where it was an hour ago. Its lateral podia are flat against the sides of the body, not extended, not drifting. The feeding tentacles work the surface without interruption. The front of the body is slightly elevated above the sediment, pressing the tentacles forward with each cycle, drawing the body after them by the contraction of the body wall. The digestive tract is processing. The fecal casting will be deposited a few centimeters behind the current position of the body within the next several minutes, and then the animal will have moved forward again, and the casting will lie on the plane behind it, and the bacteria will begin to arrive, and the rhythm will continue into the next hour as it has continued through every hour before this one. The cold does not change. The pressure does not change. The darkness does not change. The sediment surface, gray and fine and almost featureless, extends in every direction beyond what any instrument has fully mapped. And across it, at intervals of a few meters, the pale bodies continue their slow transit, each one a processing unit, a bioturbation engine, a chemical transformer, operating without awareness of its own significance or of the vast plane it shares with others doing the same work. They are not janitors in any human sense of the word, not cleaning a floor that someone else will appreciate or that would become unlivable without their attention. They are simply animals, eating what is available, moving as slowly as they must, passing through a world that is as cold and dark and old as anything on the surface of the earth has ever been. The fecal casting on the plain behind the scotoplanes sits in the dark water, 2 centimeters of processed sediment, surrounded by the gray of the unprocessed floor. Bacteria are on it now. Nematodes thread through the sediment adjacent to it. The nitrogen at its surface is available in forms that the microbial community can use, and the microbial community is using it, slowly, at the pace the temperature allows. In a few days, the chemical distinction that marks this casting as different from the surrounding sediment will have diffused and dispersed, and the casting will settle back into the background. It will still be there as particles of processed clay and silica and the remnants of the microbial film, but it will no longer be distinguishable from the rest of the surface. It will have rejoined the gray, and then the next casting will be a few centimeters ahead of where the previous one was deposited, and the bacteria will arrive at that one too, and the nematodes will follow, and the brief elevated patch of biological activity will form and persist and disperse and be replaced. This is the rhythm, not the rhythm of a heartbeat or a breath, not the rhythm of a day or a season, but the rhythm of the abyssal plane, slow and continuous and very nearly invisible, distributed across a floor that is the largest and flattest and most sparsely inhabited habitat on the surface of the earth, maintained by animals that move at the pace of sediment and eat what centuries of ocean have delivered to them, and pass it onward, grain by grain, casting by casting, in the cold and the dark, for as long as the plane endures. The feeding tentacles press into the gray surface, one at a time, in a steady ring. Each tentacle lifts, extends, presses, gathers, draws back. The ring completes its cycle and begins again. The body moves forward a centimeter. The sediment behind it is subtly different from the sediment ahead, and the darkness holds everything: the animal, the casting, the bacteria forming on the casting, the nematodes threading toward it, the cold, slow current carrying dissolved oxygen across the plane, the layers of sediment beneath the surface recording every storm and bloom and ocean current that has ever touched this place, holds it all without weight or urgency, in the same absolute stillness it has held since long before any of these organisms arrived to move through it. On the floor of the ocean, where the water has been still for longer than there have been creatures with eyes to see it, something sits that has no brain, no muscle, no mouth in any shape a person would recognize as a mouth, and no intention of moving anywhere at all. It rests on the sediment the way a stone rests, with the same outward patience, the same apparent indifference to the passage of time. It is as wide as a dinner plate. Its surface is rough and branching, built up slowly from particles the current brought near enough to catch. From a distance, in the faint glow of a submersible's lamp, it might be a piece of coral, or a dried sponge, or a fragment of something that was once alive and is no longer. It is very much alive. It is, in fact, a single cell. The organism is called a xenophyophore. The name is not important to hold on to. What matters is the fact itself, which is one of those true things that refuses to sit quietly once known. A single cell the size of a dinner plate. A single cell that has spent years, perhaps decades, reaching this size, adding to itself, grain by careful grain, cementing sediment particles and the tiny shell fragments of long-dead microscopic organisms into a branching external structure that holds its living contents the way a house holds the life inside it. No nucleus divides and multiplies the way a cell in a growing body would. This is one cell, one continuous life, spreading itself unhurriedly across the seafloor in the permanent dark. The xenophyophore does not hunt, it does not flee. The near bottom current carries fine particles of organic matter past it, and the cell absorbs what it can from its immediate surroundings, processing the sediment chemistry in ways that are still not fully understood, contributing to the local cycling of material in ways too slow and too chemically subtle to observe directly. What is known is that its branching test, the external shell it has built for itself, becomes a kind of habitat once it exists. Foraminifera and small crustaceans and nematode worms colonize the structure's surfaces and interior spaces, finding in its complexity a microenvironment distinct from the flat open sediment around it. A single cell becomes an architecture becomes a neighborhood. Specimens of the largest known species reach nearly 8 inches across, which makes them the largest individual cells of any organism on Earth. This is not a record claimed by anything fast or warm or particularly visible to the human eye. It belongs to something that resembles, at first glance, a piece of debris. It belongs to something that has been doing what it does in places like this for a very long time, and will go on doing it long after the light of the submersible has moved on and the dark has settled back into place around it. The sediment the xenophyophore rests on is itself a record. Pressed into that surface and into every layer beneath it are the shells of organisms far smaller than anything the unaided eye could find. Foraminifera, single-celled, and most of them no larger than a grain of sand, have been raining down from the water above for as long as there has been ocean. They build their shells from calcium carbonate while they live near the surface, and when they die, the shells sink. Most dissolve in the deep, cold, slightly acidic water before they reach the floor. Those that settle above the depth at which calcium carbonate loses its stability are preserved, accumulating over millions of years into layers that can be extracted in a core sample and read the way a long letter can be read, one slow line at a time. A foraminiferan shell recovered from abyssal sediment and examined under a laboratory microscope is a small and quiet thing, 0.5 millimeter across, in most cases, ornamented with tiny pores and chambers, each chamber having been added as the organism grew. The calcite of the shell carries within it a chemical record of the water in which it formed, the temperature of the surface ocean at the time, the volume of ice locked in glaciers on land, the circulation patterns of a sea that no longer exists in the same configuration. 40 million years of ocean history is held in layers of shells like this one, each layer added at a rate of centimeters per 1,000 years. Each shell a sample taken from a moment of the past and preserved against the slow dissolution of everything that surrounds it. The foraminifera living now on the abyssal plane are not the calcified kind. Below the depth at which calcium carbonate dissolves, the shells that survive are built from agglutinated sediment particles, cemented together the way the xenophyophore builds its test, using whatever the environment provides. These agglutinated forms move through the sediment surface in ways barely perceptible to observation, extending pseudopods into the organic films that coat sediment grains, absorbing nutrition through direct contact with the substrate. They are among the most abundant organisms in abyssal sediments. Under a given square foot of seafloor, in the thin layer of surface sediment, their numbers are large enough to matter ecologically, though the life they represent is so fine-grained and so chemically quiet that only careful measurement reveals it is happening at all. Beneath the foraminifera, beneath the surface centimeter of sediment where most biological activity concentrates, the layers deepen and the living density falls, but it does not reach zero. In the upper few meters of abyssal sediment, Communities of bacteria and archaea persist in conditions of near total nutrient deprivation, their metabolism running at rates so slow that a single cell may divide only once in 1,000 years. This is not death. It is life at a pace calibrated to scarcity, burning through energy reserves at a rate the most sensitive instruments can detect only through patient accumulation of data across months of measurement. The cells are not dormant. They are working, slowly, in the way the sediment itself is slowly being transformed around them. The polychaeter worm that moves through this sediment is working at a different pace. A polychaeta no longer than a fingernail picks its way through the surface layer, its body a series of segments, each bearing a pair of small bristled appendages that grip and push against the sediment as it moves. Some polychaetes here are deposit feeders, consuming sediment directly and extracting whatever organic material it contains. Some are subsurface burrowers, drawing themselves down into the sediment column and disturbing layers that have been undisturbed for centuries. And some are predators, moving through the sediment surface in search of nematode worms and small crustaceans, detecting prey through chemical traces and the faint mechanical disturbance of nearby movement. The burrowing polychaete leaves a signature. Where it has passed, sediment layers that were once flat and horizontal are bent and mixed, the sharp boundaries between laminations blurred into a mottled pattern that persists long after the worm has moved on. In a sediment core extracted from the abyssal plain and laid out in a laboratory, this pattern is recognizable. The mottled zone, where burrowing organisms have churned the upper sediment column, is called the bioturbated layer, and its thickness records the depth to which biological activity has penetrated. Below it, the laminations are sharp and undisturbed, each one a clean record of what fell from the water above, and when, the worm's passage, invisible at the time, survives as a feature in the geological archive. Nematode worms, far smaller than the polychaetes and far more numerous, occupy the same sediment and densities that make them the most abundant multicellular animals on the abyssal floor. They are round-bodied and smooth, without the bristled segments of the polychaete, and they move through the interstitial spaces between sediment grains rather than displacing the grains themselves. A thimbleful of abyssal surface sediment holds dozens of them, each one threading its way through the grain matrix in pursuit of bacterial films, fungal threads, and the decaying remains of whatever organic particles have reached the floor. They are nearly impossible to see without magnification and largely impossible to observe in their natural environment without disturbing the sediment that contains them. And so what is known of their lives comes mostly from sediment samples brought to the surface and examined under conditions nothing like their own. The nematode's life is not dramatic. It does not hunt across open ground or wait motionless for prey to approach. It moves through a world defined entirely by the scale of sediment grains and the chemical gradients between them, navigating by the concentration of dissolved organic molecules in the interstitial water, following gradients toward higher organic content, the way a thread follows a needle. The drama of its existence, to the extent that word fits at all, lies in the numbers. Across the full extent of the abyssal plains, the combined biomass of nematode worms represents a quantity of living carbon large enough to register in global estimates of where Earth's biological material is stored, and most of that life is in a world most people do not know exists. Something larger moves along the sediment surface. Now, a giant isopod, its body encased in overlapping plates of pale chitin, picks its way across the plain at a walking pace, and it is nearly a foot long, which in this environment is large enough to be conspicuous, though conspicuous means something different when there are no eyes to see it, and the nearest potential observer is likely a submersible lowered from a ship 4 kilometers above. Its antennae move constantly, sampling the water with the same patient attention it has always given to this place. It has been walking, or resting, or waiting for a long time. In experimental conditions, giant isopods have survived more than 4 years without food, their metabolism dropping to a maintenance level so low that the body barely changes between feedings. In the abyss, this patience is not unusual. It is the condition of the place. The isopod is following ascent, not ascent in any way the word is usually used, because there is no air here, but the chemical equivalent of one, a gradient of dissolved organic compounds diffusing outward through the near bottom water from a source some distance away. The source is a fall. Something has died and reached the floor, carrying with it a concentrated package of energy that in this food-scarce environment represents an event significant enough to draw organisms from hundreds of meters in every direction. The isopod does not know this in any way that involves knowledge. The chemical gradient increases, and the isopod moves toward where it is strongest, and this is how it has always worked, and how it will continue to work. When the isopod arrives, others have arrived before it. The chemistry of the fall, lipids and proteins beginning to break down in the cold water, releasing compounds that diffuse outward in a slow plume carried by the near bottom current, has been broadcasting its location for hours. Other isopods are here, and above the sediment, barely visible in the outer reach of a submersible lamp's beam, other things are gathering. The chemical signal is not specific. It carries no information about what kind of organism produced it or how large the package is. It says only here and organic and rich. That is enough. The water above the plain, dark and cold and carrying the quiet traffic of the deep, holds another kind of life entirely. A grenadier fish moves through it, fins working against the slight resistance of near-freezing water, its long body tapering to a thin tail that trails behind it as it holds itself horizontal, nearly motionless for long stretches, conserving energy in the way all abyssal life has learned to conserve it. The grenadier is a fish of the family Macrouridae, built for this specific intersection of depth and scarcity. Its eyes are large and pale, adapted to gather whatever faint bioluminescent light the darkness occasionally offers. Its lateral line, a sensory system running the length of the body and detecting minute pressure changes in the surrounding water, reads the environment continuously, interpreting the faint pressure signatures of organisms moving across the sediment far below. The grenadier's olfactory system is enlarged beyond what a surface fish would need. The deep ocean's darkness makes vision a secondary tool for finding food, and chemistry has taken its place. The fish reads the water the way the isopod reads the sediment, by following dissolved gradients toward their source, traveling large horizontal distances across the plain in pursuit of a signal that might lead to a whale fall or a cluster of invertebrates gathered around a smaller food source, or simply the slightly elevated organic content of a patch of sediment where marine snow has been concentrated by a bottom current. The grenadier connects the seafloor to the water column above it, consuming invertebrates and smaller fish, and carrying the energy they contain upward into the water column in its own body, eventually becoming food for things that dive from above, the long diving sperm whale, threading down through 3 kilometers of water on a single breath, reading the deep with sonar as the grenadier reads it with chemistry and pressure. The grenadier pauses. Below it, something has moved across the sediment, a small crustacean shifting between sediment patches, and the pressure wave of that movement has traveled upward through the water column and registered on the fish's lateral line as a faint perturbation, brief and directional. The fish tilts its body slightly, orienting the movement has stopped. The water settles back into its near total stillness, and the grenadier holds itself in place for a long moment, waiting for the signal to repeat. It does not. The fish resumes its slow forward movement, unhurried, reading everything and reacting to nothing in particular, continuing a search that has no beginning and no planned end, only the continuous present of the deep. The bioluminescent flash, when it comes, is brief enough that it might not register as a visual event at all. Cold blue-green, lasting a fraction of a second, produced by some small invertebrate moving through the water column between the grenadier and the sediment. The light travels no more than a few feet before the darkness absorbs it. The grenadier's pale eyes have registered it, and the fish turns slightly toward where the flash appeared, and then the dark returns so completely that the flash might never have happened, and the fish moves on through the nothing. These flashes occur at unpredictable intervals across the abyssal plain. An organism brushed by a current produces one, a predator's approach triggers another, a brief signal that may be a warning or a deterrent, or something that serves no purpose that can be named with certainty from outside the organism that made it. The plain below, which looks featureless and still in the footage a submersible brings back, is alive with these small cold lights scattered across the dark at intervals measurable only by instrument, each one a moment of biology, completing itself in a place no sunlight has ever reached. There are places on the abyssal plain that look in submersible footage like fields, not fields in any surface sense, but wide expanses of sediment where the life is dense enough or distinctive enough in appearance to give the floor a textured, inhabited quality rather than the blank uniformity one might expect. In certain portions of the Pacific, at particular depths and latitudes, where the rain of organic matter from the surface is consistent enough to sustain higher biomass. The camera moving slowly over the seafloor passes over holothurians at regular intervals, their pale bodies pressed against the sediment surface, their feeding tentacles moving in the slow mechanical rhythm of continuous work. Between them, on every square yard of sediment, the surface is marked by the traces of previous passage, fecal castings, feeding trails pressed into the fine mud, depressions where a body rested and then moved on. The trails persist. In the deep sea, where bottom currents are often too slow to redistribute surface sediment on any meaningful timescale, the marks an organism leaves behind can remain legible for months or years. A biologist examining time-lapse footage taken by a benthic lander can track the movement of a single sea cucumber across the sediment over the course of weeks, its slow displacement marking a visible line in the surface, the feeding trail a record of where it has been. In this way, the plain is not featureless at all. It is covered in a script written by slow bodies, in slow time, every line of it meaningful to the organisms that come after and find the chemistry of the sediment altered by the passage of something that came before. The polychaete worm that follows behind a sea cucumber's trail is responding to that alteration. The fecal castings the sea cucumber leaves are chemically distinct from the surrounding sediment, reduced in microbial biomass immediately after passage, as the cucumber has extracted much of the bacterial content, but colonized again within hours by bacteria that find in the processed material a substrate with a different texture and a different mix of available compounds. The polychaete's own feeding behavior shifts when it moves onto a casting, its searching pace slowing as it encounters a patch of sediment worth investigating more carefully. And nematodes, following the polychites find in its own disturbances another gradient to follow. The plain supports a food web of extraordinary thinness, but genuine depth, each level feeding on the work of the level before, each organism leaving the environment slightly different from how it found it. The sediment itself, seen in cross-section in a core sample, tells this story in layers. The uppermost centimeter is bioturbated, mixed, inhabited. Below that, the boundary between mixed and unmixed sediment is sharp and horizontal, and beneath it the laminations are clean, each one deposited in sequence, each one a record of a particular period of the ocean's history. The deeper one goes in the core, the older the sediment. At 2 meters, the sediment might be 20,000 years old. At 5 meters, perhaps 100,000. The record is intact because the organisms that work the surface never reach more than a certain depth. Their bioturbation contained to the uppermost layer, and below that containment, the archive is preserved exactly as it was laid down. This is one of the ways the abyssal plain serves the understanding of the planet. It holds a record that nowhere on land can match, undisturbed by the grinding of glaciers or the upheaval of tectonics, compressed only slightly by the weight of sediment above it, carrying in its chemistry and its microfossils a history of ocean temperatures and ice volumes and carbon concentrations that stretches back tens of millions of years. The organisms living in the surface sediment are not the keepers of this record. They are, if anything, the agents of a very slow erasure at the top, their bioturbation blurring the most recent laminations, but their presence there, their slow continuous reworking of the surface, is itself a process that the record preserves evidence of. In the mottled patterns that characterize every bioturbated zone in every core ever extracted from the deep sea floor, the plain continues in every direction. It is not possible to hold its extent in mind with any sensory reality because the scale is too large for anything the body normally navigates. The largest abyssal plains extend for thousands of miles, covering areas larger than any continent, their flatness maintained by the progressive burial of all underlying topographic relief beneath the slow accumulation of sediment. Within that flatness, nothing is perfectly uniform. The distribution of organisms follows the distribution of food, and the distribution of food follows the distribution of productivity in the water far above, and that productivity follows the patterns of ocean circulation that bring nutrients to the surface in some places and not others. Where the surface ocean blooms, the floor beneath is slightly richer. Where the surface is nutrient poor, the floor beneath is among the most food-scarce environments on Earth. Yet, even in the most food-scarce of those regions, life persists. The bacteria in the sediment persist, their metabolism running at barely measurable rates. The foraminifera persist, extending pseudopods into the thin organic films on sediment grains. Nematodes persist, threading the interstitial spaces of the grain matrix. A sea cucumber, pale and slow and continuous in its work, passes over the surface of a plain where no other megafauna may be visible in any direction for meters in every direction, and it continues its feeding, pressing its tentacles into the sediment with the same steady rhythm it has always used, extracting from the thin organic content of the mud whatever can be extracted, leaving behind it the altered castings that bacteria will begin colonizing before the animal has moved its own body length away. The plain is almost entirely silent. Sound travels far in seawater, farther than in air, and faster, but in the abyss there is so little to generate it that the acoustic environment of the seafloor is one of the quietest on Earth. The slight creak of a whale's vocalization produced at the surface or in the upper water column, can propagate downward and reach the abyssal floor as a faint, attenuated signal. Its energy spread across such a large volume of water that it arrives as barely more than a pressure fluctuation. The organisms on the floor, most of them without ears in any conventional sense, do not register it. The grenadier, with a lateral line sensitive to pressure changes, may respond to strong low-frequency sounds, but there are almost none here. The water rests, the sediment holds. The organisms move at their own paces through the permanent dark. The last light that reached this floor arrived 4 kilometers above, at the surface, and was absorbed within the first 200 meters of its descent. What fell after that was chemistry. The slow organic snow of dead cells and fragments and fecal pellets, carrying energy locked inside molecular bonds, drifting down through miles of cold, dark water before arriving on a floor that has been waiting in the same position, with the same patient stillness, for millions of years. The organisms that live here have arranged themselves around that falling chemistry with a thoroughness that looks on examination like something intentional and coordinated, though it is neither. It is the outcome of a very long filtering, in which the forms that could extract enough from the thin supply to maintain themselves and reproduce persisted, and the forms that could not did not, and what remains is exactly what the environment can sustain, shaped to it precisely, fitted to it without excess or waste. The grenadier holds itself above the plain, fins moving in slow arcs, tail trailing in the near-freezing water. Its large, pale eyes scan the sediment below. Nothing moves. The darkness is complete and absolute and has no boundary the eye can find, stretching upward through kilometers of water toward a surface that might, for all the fish knows, through its sensory experience of the world, not exist at all. The fish does not experience the dark as an absence. It experiences the near-bottom water as information, the pressure waves carried by other organisms moving through it, the chemical gradients that indicate food or its absence, the faint bioluminescent flicker that occasionally punctuates the permanent night. The world, from inside the fish's sensory reach, is not empty. It is dense with signal, if quiet in volume, and the fish reads it continuously. The isopod has fed and rested and will eventually move on when the chemical gradient it followed has been exhausted, following the diffusing edge of the scent plume in the direction of decreasing concentration until a new gradient appears from another direction. The sea cucumber has moved a few more centimeters and deposited another casting on the sediment surface, and bacteria are already beginning their colonization of its altered chemistry. The xenophyophore sits where it sat an hour ago, where it sat a year ago, where it will sit a decade from now if nothing disturbs it, its single enormous cell processing the surrounding environment in ways too subtle and too slow to observe without very patient instruments. The foraminifera in the sediment below extend their pseudopods into the organic films between grains. Taking in what can be taken, the sediment accumulates. Somewhere above, too far above to imagine with any sensory clarity, a copod near the surface produces a fecal pellet that begins its 6-week fall through the water column. Most of its nutritional content will be consumed by bacteria during the descent. What arrives at the floor will be a nearly featureless film of material, detectable by chemistry rather than by any visible feature, settling onto the surface of the plain with no sound and no disturbance and no witness. It will become part of the sediment, and the sediment will become part of the record, and the record will persist for longer than the ocean above it will persist in its current configuration, layered and undisturbed and full of the chemical memory of every organism that lived near the surface of the sea. since before the continents were arranged as they are. The plain is older than most of the mountain ranges on land. It formed when the oceanic crust beneath it cooled and sank and was progressively buried beneath the accumulating sediment, and that process took tens of millions of years, and the result is this: a flatness so complete that over hundreds of miles of seafloor, the variation in depth is measured in inches. Nothing on the land surface of the Earth is as flat as this. Nothing else that formed through geological process without leveling or smoothing by any biological or human agency has achieved this degree of horizontality. The flatness is the record of time.